Well, good morning, everybody. This is Leah Etling with Running USA. It's a real honor this morning to be here with Dr. Jonathan Kim and Dr. Erin Baggish, and they are the researchers and authors behind a recent study that really looked very closely at cardiac activity during marathon races. So I would like to have each of them introduce themselves and tell us a little bit more about their work, if you could.
Maybe I'll start. Dr. Erin Baggish. I'm a professor of medicine now at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. Spent more than 2 decades living in Boston at Harvard Medical School, where I had the privilege of being the medical director for the Boston Marathon, and that was really the time that Jonathan and I got this work started long, long time ago. Great to be with you.
I'm Dr. Jonathan Kim. I direct sports cardiology at Emory. Right now, I'm also the chair for our American College of Cardiology Sports Cardiology Council. And Aaron has been a dear friend and colleague for pushing 20 years now. And I think Racer has been probably the thing that we cherish the most. So excited to be here as well.
Awesome. Well, you've alluded to it a little bit, but tell us more about what prompted you to explore marathons as the focus of your most recent research.
So I'll begin. I mean, the racer story actually goes back pretty much close to 25 years ago. At that point, I was a relatively recent college graduate. I had no interest in becoming a physician. I was living and training at high altitude in Colorado, trying to hit a marathon qualifying time for the Olympic trials, and unfortunately lost a training partner, a young, fit guy, and also in his mid-20s. It was a sub 2:30 marathoner, and he dropped dead one morning on the way to the track. And for me, that was a game changer. It was pivotal in terms of getting me to think about heart disease and how heart disease can and does affect people who are in the prime of their life. And it was a kind of a wake-up call for me to think about going to medical school, which I did. One of the things I did when I was in school, and this was kind of a pet hobby of mine, was to start collecting newspaper clippings of cardiac arrest cases that came out of the distance running world. And that was a hobby that I just did very casually on the side. And fast forward a number of years later, I had finished up my training and was on faculty in Boston at Harvard. And a young man by the name of Jonathan Kim walked into my office to discuss research opportunities. And we got to talking about this obsession of mine, which soon thereafter became an obsession of his. And with his, under his, really his leadership from the beginning, we put together the protocol for the first racer study, which was published in 2012. And that really was a study that looked at where things were in the early part of the century in the States around what was happening with races, how often cardiac arrests were occurring, and importantly, when a runner did go down, how often were they likely to be resuscitated successfully. So with Racer 1 done, and with a number of things that came out of that, we thought it was time to do Racer 2, and that's where we are now.
Dr. Kim, would you like to add anything there?
I don't know if I could add anything as eloquent as that. I would completely concur with that back history. And I personally never came close to qualifying for the U.S. Olympic team. I did run growing up. I ran in high school. I ran in college, not to the level of Dr. Baggish, but I graduated from Emory and ran at Division III level. And I think for both of us, the passion within the exercise physiology, sudden cardiac arrest, and outcomes among athletes has just been obviously what's driven both of our careers. And I'll certainly never forget having those early discussions about thinking about Racer 1 and to see that go to completion. Obviously, everything that came about after that, which we're going to talk about, and then moving through to Racer 2. It's been just phenomenal and a real thrill to be a part of this. And I think there's certainly more to come. Racer 3, Racer 4, but spin-offs, all sorts of questions that I think we're hopeful to answer over the coming years.
Excellent. And I'm sure that for those of us who really monitor news about marathons and other distance events, those articles that Dr. Baggish was referring to were probably more prominent in the 13 years between the two studies. At least it feels like they were. So tell us about the results of Racer 2. What were some of the predominant findings?
Absolutely. And I'll be brief, obviously, because we could spend just an hour just going over every little detail in the study. But overall, there were 3 times as many race finishers over the last 13 years compared to the Racer 1 period. So over 29 million. And with the help of Running USA, with athletes to be able to identify race finishers, with the cooperation of race directors, USA Track and Field, but maybe most importantly, all of the race participants that we were able to contact, we were able to identify 176 cases which actually led to almost an identical incidence of sudden cardiac arrest compared to the racer one period. And we were able to identify 59 deaths, unfortunately. But when you take those numbers into account, what that translates to is an almost 50% reduction in the incidence of sudden death. So, despite three times as many runners and an incidence that hasn't changed, you're now almost 70%. Your chance of survival if you suffered a sudden cardiac arrest was close to 70%, which is akin to what we see for casinos, airports, high schools with emergency action plans and AEDs. So when you have kind of that publicly accessible availability, and that's really amazing when you think about it. When you think about 13.1, 26.2 miles, the density of people to be able to have that is just remarkable. And that was our primary finding. The second thing that we looked at was for causes. And what we found was that the most common cause now was coronary artery disease. So the development of atherosclerosis, the layman term having a heart attack, in older runners is the most common cause. And that's different compared to what we found in Racer One, where it was one of the inherited heart conditions was the most common cause then. There may be some methodological reasons as to why we found that back then, because coronary artery disease was still quite common in that study as well. But there's no doubt that kind of the standard development of these atherosclerotic plaques, coronary disease, having a heart attack during a run was the most common cause. But again, having these emergency action plans in place really was what drove survival. And what I mean by that is having a defibrillator in close proximity that's easily accessible. Among the cases we were able to vet completely was the primary driver of survival. And it certainly makes sense, even though we weren't able to completely vet every case, as to why you would see such a dramatic improvement in survival. So those were the two, really three kind of key critical findings of Racer 2.
I want to really dive into some of the things that changed on the event level. But before we get to that, one of the things that you mentioned really prompted me to think about runners and our perceptions of our own health. And I guess maybe the takeaway is, do runners need to be more cautious about checkups and especially ones regarding their cardiac health?
Yeah, I mean, I can start with that one. I mean, this has been kind of the foundation for the last 20 years of clinical work for me, and that is the concept that no amount of fitness, no amount of running confers immunity from heart disease. And that is that you simply can't outrun your cardiac risk factors, whether it's high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, a family history. And so the concept of exercise being something that's good for those things is spot on. It absolutely is part of the way we reduce risk and treat those things, but it doesn't completely erase them. So when you're asking for a kind of a take-home message for the running community who's listening to this recording, it would be that, it's all of our own personal responsibilities to work with a clinician, a doctor, a nurse, whoever it is in your environment, to understand your risk factors and to do something about them. To assume that running is going to completely take care of those things is a mistake, and it's a mistake that we see repeated over and over again.
It's good advice. Turning a little bit toward the race director front, since that is the predominant audience for this broadcast anyway, can you elaborate a little bit on some of the specific changes that took place between the studies, different emergency response protocols that might have contributed to some of the altered findings that you came up with?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the starting point is to go back and review some of the things we learned in Racer One, which set the stage for a lot of work done at both grassroots and also at the national level of the sport. And I think there are three basic things that we learned. One is that cardiac arrests most commonly happen toward the very end of a race, almost always within sight of the finish line. Two is that the perfect predictors of survival, meaning the things that had to be in place for a runner to survive one of these things, was immediate bystander CPR and rapid access to defibrillation. And the third at that point, which was the sobering message in Racer One, was that these simple, basic life-saving things were not universally available among race courses. So what was done at that point, and certainly Boston and the World Marathon Majors played a role in this, was to really start beating the drum, getting out there and educating race directors everywhere. And that started with changes in our own local races, making certain that we were putting defibrillators where they needed to be, that we were educating runners coming through the expo about the importance of handling CPR and actually training people to do that. And we have numerous anecdotes of runners having gone through our CPR program and then using CPR, whether it's on or in their shop home. It's just a skill that everyone should have. So we thought, say with 100% certainty that this explains the results, but in my mind, and I'll let Jonathan take over, I don't think there's any other way to explain why we saw such a dramatic reduction in fatalities despite a totally stable arrest incidence.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think to the question about the kind of race director community, I think one of the take homes for me, and it's interesting. So I live in Atlanta. I'm part of the medical oversight committee for the Peachtree Road Race, which I'm sure listeners to this um, podcast all know that race, largest 10K in the world. And so it's very much handled like a marathon with the appropriately strategically placed AEDs and EMS assets throughout the course. And we have certainly observed similar successors. We have the challenges with heat, of course, and so we certainly get our fair share of cardiac events, and we have had an excellent survival rate because of these plans in place. And so yes, I think we've gotten to a stage where when you look at marathons and half marathons, it's probably not 100%. So there's still work to do, but we should think about this as well for some of the smaller races as well. And I understand that 5Ks, 10Ks around the country, it's challenging to have the exact same type of assets that a larger marathon has, but it's an important thing to think through for any for any race event organizing committee involved with the whoever the medical staff is to think about where you're going to set up or establish your emergency medical services and to what degree you're going to have available. And I just want to make one other point to the question about uh, listeners thinking about should they get a checkup as well. It's also a message, I think, to practitioners. Because Aaron can attest, many times we see patients, and the first thing that the athlete will say is, "Oh, yeah, I was told I run a marathon. Why am I even here?" And they may have cardiac risk factors. And that is another unfortunate tale that's out there, which is not just believed by runners out there, but a lot of healthcare practitioners as well, and focusing on the primary prevention. I think Aaron and I both agree that that is the future direction of where we need to take this next, because that incidence hasn't changed at all over 23 years now. So there's room for improvement.
Well, and maybe there are things that the running community can do in terms of races and events to help promote the importance of that prevention. That could certainly be a direction I could see us going. I wanted to touch on what you said about small races because I think that's really important, and a lot of our members of Running USA do produce smaller events. You've both been medical directors for significant races. What would be some of the recommendations you'd make for smaller races in terms of preparation? What can they do to help keep these numbers down?
I'll start and just acknowledge that not all races are resourced the same way, both from a financial perspective as well as a medical infrastructure perspective. And on the balance, whenever you have a race, even a race that's not well medically supervised, you're doing more good than harm. So in no way, shape, or form would we want any race director listening to us to think about our message being to discourage them from doing what they're doing, because the more races, the better. That being said, once you understand what your resources are, there are some very simple things that can be done to maximize their efficacy. And so again, the two things we're talking about that are most critical are as many people as possible that are involved in that race, not just the medical professionals, but many people as possible, whether they're manning a water station, whether they're putting down road cones. Every single person that knows CPR that's involved in your event is going to increase the chance of a life being saved. The second thing, again, is this issue of defibrillator access. Not all race courses are fortunate enough to have an optimal amount of defibrillators along the course, but what can be done is that the defibrillators can be placed strategically. So again, two rules of thumb. It's impossible to move defibrillators upstream against the current of runners, and most arrests occur late in the race. So a strategy, even in a race that can only provide several defibrillators, would be to prioritize those at the finish line and slightly upstream of the finish line that can move with the runners toward an event should someone go down. And I think for the most part, those are going to be attainable in a vast majority of the even smallest races around the country.
I'll just add a little bit to the CPR education front and just including kind of a major story here in this country, really around the world, which was Damar Hamlin's event in early 2023, January 2nd. And since then, really a tribute to him. I mean, he's put so much into this, but a lot of emphasis on emergency action planning and CPR, hands-only CPR training. And a lot of races, certainly at the larger races, incorporate this at expos. That's become a big thing over the last 10 years. But just a continued emphasis as well in the running committee, because I couldn't agree more. The more people who know CPR, I mean, this goes back to Racer One, where there wasn't the AED deployment to where it is today. And what was predictive of survival in Racer One? It was bystander CPR. So that it really begins with that, and the more people that learn CPR, I think is the first step.
So definitely CPR training for volunteers. That sounds really important. And then can I ask, because I think it would be a logical question, is there a recommended number of runners at the event per available AED that you recommend?
I don't think that there's a well-established number within the industry. I think the availability of ECDs is going to be heavily predicated on the specifics of each race. So the ease with which a defibrillator can be moved from point A to point B within a race, whether that's on the back of a medic with an AED in a backpack, on a bicycle, or whether that's using golf carts or other transportation means. Each race really has to look at how quickly they can get a defibrillator from point A to point B, with a goal of being to get that on the collapse runner within 3 minutes at the highest, is going to determine what the ideal ratio of runners to defibrillators would be.
Interesting. Okay, great. One of the things that Running USA has recently introduced is that we're now offering an AED rental program with the hope of making the devices more accessible. So we're excited about that, and hopefully some of our members watching this will see the importance of it as a result. I wanted to turn a little bit to the data side, but before we do that, are there any other aspects of the findings that you'd like to highlight or point out?
Maybe just one, which is when you look at trends across time, what we did observe was that since 2020, this was a 13-year time frame, and of course, we just went through a once in 100 years pandemic, and there's an important question to ask: was there an impact of the pandemic? And I want to be careful and emphasize pandemic, not the virus, the pandemic, on outcomes among cardiac arrests among marathon runners. And we did observe a slight uptick that was, at least by statistics, significant. And this was really driven by the highest risk demographic, who are men who run marathons. So the question, of course, is what drove that slight increase? And there's probably a few different answers. One, just from an epidemiological standpoint, and you see this anytime you look at registries of or epidemiologic studies of sudden cardiac death, sometimes you just get random blips that are unexplained. And we also saw an increase the latter half of the 2000 to 2009 decade, which kind of leveled off from 2010 up to 2020. Then you see another uptick. So there may not be an actual explanation. And maybe as you track data further along, you'll see things level off. It's also possible that the pandemic itself led to issues, which is individuals that weren't seeking their standard primary preventive care. That's generally what was observed among the general population. There's clear data among young athletes that demonstrated that SARS-CoV-2 itself was not driving or a danger to the heart as it relates to myocarditis or inflammation of the heart. And in the cases that we were able to fully vet since 2020, we did not see any myocarditis. So I don't think this is a quote unquote viral thing. It's probably more likely something on that realm as to what could potentially explain this slight uptick. Another potential issue that we discussed is, can't prove this, of course, but maybe a shift in terms of who's running marathons from the pandemic. People are stir crazy. All of a sudden, you're back at, hey, I'm going to run a marathon. That's kind of a standard thing people do when there's something crazy that happens in life. So it's possible that new people not necessarily exposed to the training might have contributed to this as well. These are certainly important questions to ask, and maybe we'll be able to answer some of these as we kind of relook at the data. But that's probably an additional observation that's worthy to mention.
Yeah, and I'll just build on that and say that Jonathan very carefully excluded one possible explanation from his list, and that's that this had anything to do with the COVID-19 vaccine. I want our listeners to come away from this without a shred of doubt that when we looked at the autopsies of these athletes that had arrests during the and deaths during the COVID-19 pandemic period, that there was nothing to suggest this was a vaccination related event. And this is always a knee-jerk reaction, but it's one not only in our study, but across virtually every scientific field study find is just it's a false assumption.
Great. Thank you for that. Super interesting information on both fronts. So, looking towards Racer 3, which I'm sure you're already thinking about, tell us as a running industry, what can we do better in terms of collecting data, sharing data, helping make more research like this possible? Because I think it's really important for our industry.
Well, I'll just
Well,
start with kind of uh,
oh, go
go,
ahead, Jonathan.
I was just going to start with kind of a pie in the sky, which is something that we clamor for when we talk about young competitive athletes and sudden cardiac arrest and death. Is we don't have any sort of kind of mandatory reporting, um, and that is a challenge anytime you think of any sort of epidemiologic study. So even with the estimates that we put forth, that's a limitation upfront, which is we don't 100% know if we captured every case. And then even with the denominator, there's some challenges there as well. So as we look to the future and you really kind of think like what would be the game changer as it relates to really being able to fully address these questions and ultimately be able to improve the health and outcomes for runners, it would be some way to be able to capture events across the board.
I'll add a few thoughts. One, again, the sobering message from Racer 2 is that we've not made a bit of a dent in terms of the incidence of these arrests actually happening. In fact, if you look at the numbers carefully, the incidence during 2010 to 2023 was actually a slightly bit higher. And so what that means is that there's been absolutely no change in the number of people, particularly the number of men that run marathons, which is on average about 1 in 100,000. Put that into context. That's 2 years at New York, 2 years at Chicago, or 1 year if you combine the two races. So I hate when people use the term this is a rare event. Rare is a very subjective word, but in my mind, this is still a common enough event that it requires the community to come together to think about it. And what I think we would like is, as you alluded to a little earlier, Leah, is for there to be more outreach and education about upstream things that can be done, taking care of your own health, understanding your own cardiovascular risk factors. And we would hope that by the time Racer 3 comes around, if those initiatives are done, we're going to continue to see low death rates, but also see a decline in the arrest rate itself so that this overall phenomenon is less common. The second thing I'll say, and this is again following Jonathan's kind of ideal world wish list, we have to remember that what we've done is we've studied marathon and half marathon races. And for anyone in the industry or anyone who runs knows, the race is the culmination of a lifestyle and of a process. And what we don't have right now is the ability to accurately study these events that occur during training and everyday living in these runners that are preparing for races. So if I had, again, in an ideal world, if I had an ask of the running community, it would be to think about a way to come together to study the incidence of these events among people that are preparing for these races. Because by the time you get to the race, there's some selection bias. We capture those that have made it to the race, and we have no idea how big a problem this is in those that are trying to get ready to actually make it to the start line.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. There was only one study, and it was from another dear friend and close colleague of ours, Paul Thompson, who looked at joggers in Rhode Island. These were recreational joggers, so it's a little bit of a different population, but at least it gets to the question of what's going on with training. And actually, the incidence, I believe, was around like 1 in 7,600 or somewhere in that number. It's clearly much higher because again, you're capturing kind of that buildup, and that's a really important point. And I couldn't agree more with Aaron with the hating the term rare because yeah, that's still X number of people per year that who are out there trying to have a good time and end up having a cardiac arrest on the course. But the buildup is kind of where most of this is going to happen. And you think about 5Ks too. I mean, 5K is a much more intense race. People are pushing harder. We have no idea how often this occurs. That's a tough question to answer. That's really where you need some sort of mandatory reporting, just given the sheer volume of races out there. But to be able to have any sort of potential estimate, nobody has any idea. But I would suspect it's probably not a trivial number.
Well, definitely sobering, but I think this is all great information for us to take back as an industry and have a conversation about, in the interim between now and our next conference in 2026, but certainly at that event as well. So I just want to thank you both for your time today. This has been an invaluable conversation, and thank you for the research. It's really important.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to highlight it. And I know we both appreciate the opportunity to both chat with you and also to get out our message to the constituents of Run USA.
Absolutely.
Ab- Absolutely. Thank you.